Hello and welcome to College Admissions with Mark and Anna. Each week we talk about different college admissions topics and answer those tough questions you may be dealing with concerning getting into the college of your choice. We know how stressful this process can be, so each episode we try to make it easier to navigate. Now, here are your hosts, Anna Wren and Mark Hofer.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the College Admissions Podcast with Mark and Anna. This is your host, Anna Wren, and
Mark Hofer.
Hey, Mark, how's it going?
It's good. We are in the season of application deadlines, aren't we?
We are. And I can tell you anxiety is high, right? Is it the case with your students as well?
Oh, I think that's the season of anxiety, isn't it? I think before Thanksgiving and the winter break, this is the anxiety season.
It is. And I think it's centered around, all these students that I have heard it multiple times from my students, what if I don't get into any college? And, there's always I feel like in the media, I saw there was an article last year about a top student out of New York City who got into 0 colleges. And I want to say that's rare, Mark, but I think it's because maybe they didn't have some help with the list, or maybe their list was a little skewed, because the truth is there's less kids applying to college this year as a whole.
Well, there's less kids applying to college, but also as soon as you hear that somebody didn't get into that many colleges, I think because of the work we do, I think our knee-jerk reaction is they weren't applying to the right colleges for them.
Yes. I always emphasize a balanced list. And are you applying to college for the right reason?
Exactly. Well, one of the things and you said there's anxiety about getting into any college, but every year, and of course, I think everybody who does counseling with high school students who are applying to college, they run into students and families who think if they don't get into one of these, and I'm going to use the word top 25 schools, they are a failure. And I think that is such a huge part of the social anxiety that's heaped on our teenagers and parents that pushes a lot of these conversations and a lot of the anxiety that we see from students. How about you?
I hear you. And here it's I don't know if it's different on the West Coast, but on the East Coast, even top 30 or top 40. But I can understand certain parents of certain backgrounds, I'm going to call it the Asians because I'm Asian, to think that, you have to be in the top 20 or top 25, or I've heard before on a consult, if they're not in the top 10, then it's a failure. But I don't think people understand that it's not you follow the script and you get into college. That isn't always how it works with quote unquote top colleges for admissions. But I think part of the reason driving anxiety and why we want to talk about it is because I had a student who had to transfer, and I was like, why did you apply to your first school early decision in the first place? And she was just saying how all the even if her parents weren't giving her stress at home, that she was feeling stressed at school because everyone was just talking about applying to college everywhere and how it was the bag you're wearing, or it's the car your parents drive, or whatever, right? So it's it become this almost consumer branded thing. And so she's it's hard to not give into that peer pressure.
One of the things, I don't know if you've experienced this, it used to be rare, but the last 2 years I've had a number of students who have said, yeah, I want to apply to Stanford. I want to apply to Harvard. And I said, well, okay, that's fine, but it's really not in line with the conversations that we've had. And they come back with, I want to apply because I want to see if I can get in. And it's not that they'll go if they're accepted. They just want to see if they can get in. So that, like you say, is it the bag? Is it the car? Is it, the name brand of the institution you're applying to and that you got in? So I don't know what's driving that here most recently, other than, we blame everything on social media. So we can start.
It could be bragging rights. They're looking for those bragging rights. I think that does make sense because I had a student, I asked them, what's your priority? And the student was so practical. They're I want to get the most value. meaning I want to go to the best school I can for the least amount of money.
Yep.
And I was like, well, that's a very practical way to approach college admissions. And I'm a big fan of that. But at the same time, you have like parents that are like, well, let's just add, like you said, Harvard, Stanford, whatever, and just see. Even if, especially when you're like, we talk about sometimes, like when you're middle class, it's like you make too much money to qualify for financial aid, and yet you don't have enough money to pay full price. And so then I wonder, is that the best use of your kids' time and mental well-being?
Well, and your money. So you're exactly right. Return on investment. And I think that all consultants who really want to help families, they're looking for the best return on investment for their family and the student and their goals. And I think that's the leading part of the conversation. And I think if more students and families actually took a step back and asked themselves, some of the real foundational questions of why they want to go to college in the first place and what they want to actually accomplish, then they start looking for schools that can serve that, as opposed to, is it on the list of 100 top schools according to somebody. So when you speak with a student and a family about designing the list and they say, why aren't there any Ivies on it? What do you say?
I say that I like them to research based on fit themselves to see if any of the Ivies are a fit for them. Because honestly, I don't think you should it's not playing darts, in my opinion. You shouldn't just apply just because. And I think I would really want to understand, especially if the family might not be able to afford it, why are we applying? Like, why would you do that? Go through all that work just to get in, but not be able to go.
I think you're exactly right. You say, why are you applying? And I think that's a conversation to have very early. And that is one of the driving factors when you can actually tease out, why are they saying that's an important school for them to apply to? A lot of times you find out it's the name of the handbag, it's the name of the car, it's the prestige, it's the I got into, more than it is the educational advantage or the return on investment. So I think that's one of our biggest nemesis in the work that we do is trying to tease out what's really most important to the student and the family, and then also just dispelling some of the myths about elite colleges and admission rates.
Yes. For example, like, why does everyone assume a quality education can only come from the top 25 schools? Like, well, I don't understand that.
I know you've got examples. So have you got an example of a conversation you've had with a student regarding to identify why is it important to you to apply to an elite college?
I think everyone, and I'm sure you hear the same thing, it's the opportunities, right? They attract these amazing professors. And I'm not knocking the professors because I loved my professors as well. But it's not necessarily not what I sometimes say to that, though, is like, not everyone who is an expert knows how to teach. But aside from that, I would say, yes, they talk about opportunities, the networking, and that's usually what they talk about. But the truth is, when you talk about opportunities these days, there are other schools that give you wonderful opportunities too, whether it's research or internships or co-ops. And I think the economy being the way it is, I think more of my students, I don't know if you're hearing this from your students, is how do they define a successful college experience if they can get a job and be financially independent afterwards? And there's no guarantee that that will come from an Ivy League education or any elite school.
Or any school.
Or any school.
It's not a correlation that if you go to school, you get a job. You have a higher chance and a better probability. But that's one of the things you talk about, the quality of teaching. It's interesting. I wrote a piece on the difference between professing and teaching. And I said that a lot of students don't realize that their high school teachers are often much more prepared pedagogically and based on curriculum development than their professors ever will be. and that they don't realize most high school teachers, they are invested in your education. They want you to learn things. And then when students get to college and they are under the assumption that that's true for all of their professors and don't realize professors don't really have an investment necessarily in whether they learn or not. So that is an interesting thing. I got a lot of interesting hater mail for saying that high school students often had some of the best teachers that they'll ever have, no matter what school they go to. And I had a couple professors who wanted to make sure that that wasn't appreciated. So.
Because the truth is, like, sometimes when we talk, I don't know, like, let's talk about rankings for a second, because there's so many different types of rankings, right?
Yep.
And I try to ask them, well, which rankings are you going off of to determine that this is a top school for you? And obviously the popular one is US News and World Report, which I don't know if most people know was started as a way to sell magazines. And they recently changed their ranking guide this year, which I've heard some colleges or universities are not appreciative of the changes. But aside from that, I would say that they will say, like, you know, either it's the national rankings or this or that. But if I'm going to pick a rank, I will tell my students, like, hey, why don't you look at, I like major rankings more, but only as a starting point. Because, like, one of my students who's interested in engineering was saying, like, she toured so many colleges and she's so blessed to do that. But she's like, even though it's a top school, like top 5 in the country, it's not what I'm looking for in an engineering program. It's too theoretical. She's looking for something more applicable. She wants to get a job out of college. So I think rankings can be a good starting point, depending on what you're looking for. How about you, Mark? How do you think students, if they are going to use rankings, should use them?
Well, I think they need to become a student again and do their research and learn what the rankings are and how they're developed. And I think US News and World Report, yes, it started, they started that to sell magazines, but they had to come up with some way of putting credence to their evaluations. And it's interesting that they have changed it. It used to be, I mean, they had such interesting metrics in their evaluations as how much money did alumni give back to their school. That was part of their ranking.
Right.
Well, even now with the change, 55% of the evaluation is based on 4 main characteristics. The highest ranked ones are, so peer assessment is 20% of the rankings for where your placement is on that 100 list. Peer assessment. So if you have students who are at a school where they don't have to work because it's being paid for by mom and dad, and they don't have a care in the world, and they're in a beautiful location and everything is taken care of, yeah, they're going to have a pretty good, I think, peer assessment. Another part is graduation rate. Well, there again, if you're not working to put yourself through school, or you don't have any other thing, your chances of graduation are higher. Borrower debt. We don't realize that some of the lowest debt is from the Ivy League, and that's because most of the families that are accepted can pay full ticket price. And then financial resources to the student. The endowment of Harvard is in the billions and billions of dollars, so they have much more money per student than, say, like a state school. And then the last one is faculty salaries. 8% of the evaluation where you are on that 100 list is how much professors are paid. Well, they can be paid a lot if you have this huge endowment. So it's, I ask students, please identify how that rank is made before you assume that the place on the ranking and the difficulty in getting into it means a good school or good education for you. So I challenge students, become a student. This is your first homework. What do you think?
I think it's great. I think that it's similar. Yes, absolutely. Be an educated buyer. right? This is about to be one of your most expensive purchases made by your family, no doubt, right? I think like I was seeing last year, like some of the New York City schools were at 90 something thousand for cost of attendance per year. So this is really expensive. Do your research, right? Do not rely on just what someone else may say to make an informed decision. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
When you say informed, where do you have students look for information so that they can actually tease out some of the we have the social reality, and then we have reality. And I think, like you said, students are stressed out because all they hear are their peers and other parents and parents who hear other parents saying that, these schools are the best. So we have this source of who the best is. And I think in most cases, they're seriously misguided. So who do you point, or what do you point students towards as resources?
In terms of like what is the best, I think, again, it's subjective. So I usually tell students like they can start at numerous places, whether it's common data set, which is different information, or the actual school's website, although you got to be careful of the marketing sometimes. But there's so many websites, and I like them to look at, like you mentioned before, like what is the graduation rate? Or more importantly, for some students these days is what is the job placement rate? Or like if you're going into grad school, what is the placement rate for grad school? And I think it's those metrics that should play into it that matter a bit more. I like to go back to the study that's done at Georgetown. I'm not mentioning it because I went there, but it just happens that they did the study that, in most professions, it doesn't matter which college you went to. It matters more what major you majored in terms of quote unquote financial success. But for sure, like having a business major and more about engineering, certain schools may make a difference, right? In terms of your education and the opportunities offered. So it really kind of varies a little bit. But I like my students, like we create like a little rubric. I don't know if you do the same thing with yours, Mark, but I have them go and fill it out. And based on filling out that information, they get a much clearer sense of whether or not certain schools are ranked in their list, or whether they should be ranked in their list where they are ranked. Does that make sense? So a surprising one is like Purdue, for example. We all know Purdue engineering is great. A lot of kids will knock it because it's a public school sometimes, but like they have a crazy amount of research labs and equipment available for students to use. I would say more than many universities out there, right? So if you have a student who like really, wants that hands-on experience, or like WPI is also big on hands-on experience, then that's one of the better schools for them. Does that make sense? Versus like we said before, a school that might be quote unquote ranked in a certain way, but again, might be more theoretical and is not what they're looking for.
Absolutely. And I think you have touched on the thing that is most important, and that's sitting down and saying, what are the most valuable things? What are your goals for going to college? Why are you going to college? And what are the things you hope to accomplish when you're there? And if you can take that and then, like you say, build a rubric that says, does this college satisfy the things you just told me are most important? Now, if I don't tell you what the name of the school is or the acceptance rate, and we just use what we know the school provides, where are we going to put that on your list? Is it really something that you would like to apply to, or is it something you'd like to stay away with? And I think your student who was wanted to study engineering and wanted to do more hands-on than theoretical, that absolutely should be critical in the evaluation of which school they're applying to, because those are very different characteristics of engineering schools. And it has nothing to do with their acceptance rate, how much you pay, or the name brand of the school. So I think you're spot on. Let's identify what's most important first, and then we'll start talking about the schools, but don't do it backwards.
I love that you said that, Mark. Now, how do you talk about, for example, you've mentioned this before now, scarcity and acceptance rate? How does that factor in? How would you advise students in terms of why, because I think they think, oh, it must be a good school because everybody's applying and it's hard to get in. What would you have to say?
I say thank you for doing exactly what the elite schools have hoped you would do. And the reason why I say that is about a decade and a half ago, there were a couple of the elite schools that said, hey, let's do some simple math. If we want to lower our acceptance rate, which used to be U.S. News and World Report's major criteria for top schools, if we want to raise our spot on that list, let's do some simple math and we'll have more students apply and still the same number get in. So that means our acceptance rates goes down. So how do we go about doing that? Well, what they did was they flooded the U.S. They basically used the list of students who signed up for SAT. They sent pretty much everybody, please apply to us. And so those students did, thinking the school was courting them. And what that did was their number of applicants went up, but they kept the same number of acceptances. And so their acceptance rate went down. And that, bumped them up in the list. Everything's great. So when students are saying everybody's applying there, they're right. But that just feeds into the lower acceptance rate. And I think we've seen that. I think the Ivy League was actually coined, I think, in 1936 or 37. And it was the 8 colleges with less than 20% acceptance rate. And right now, we're looking at schools with less than 3% acceptance rate. And that's been driven by the number of people applying, but the acceptances really haven't gone up that much. So acceptance rate it's a fungible term and it can be just weird math.
I love that you said weird math, because as someone who majored in marketing in college, isn't that the scariest thing? That perception can be altered or created simply based on marketing, simply based on a trick or a manipulation of what someone is trying to sell you. And I think if students realize that, or parents realize that, they'd be in a total different ballgame, right? Because that is basically what you called it out to be, right? It's marketing. And part of it is I've also seen some colleges, I don't know if you've seen it too, but they try to obviously inflate their applications by offering fee waivers or making it free to apply by a certain deadline, so on and so forth, right? Or early action, it's not even binding, which I am a big fan of early action, actually. Because early decision, but I don't think people realize that there's so much bias in the college admissions process. Even take early decision, right? Those are for families who can afford it. Who can afford to financially commit, especially this year when the FAFSA doesn't even open on time.
Right, exactly. When they can't apply, when they can't even send in their FAFSA until December, this year is going to be an interesting circus for sure, because financial aid is going to be given out later, and who knows how that's going to influence acceptance rates and the whole bit. So yeah, that will be an interesting one. I don't know about you, but I try to come up with analogies to show families, okay, I'll give you an example of how social perception drives something to be coveted. And I mean, you can go back as far as the Dutch tulip crisis or Dutch golden age of tulips, and watching a market take off and individual tulip bulbs being worth, so many times more than they actually are worth. And it's driven by market, like you said, marketing. But the more recent one is Beanie Babies.
I remember that.
And there's a new movie out if you want to see kind of how a market can be driven and how it's even worse now with social media and being able to drive people like sheep. So it's an interesting thing how markets are valued and what is valued. Diamonds are another example. Mm-hmm. And those are all things that, they don't have any inherent worth in that they do something, but the social pressure to own one or to be one, it's a strong one, as human beings are driven by it.
That's such a great point you raise. I did not know that about tulips. Ironically, I'm going to go see some this weekend on a farm. But no, that's so fascinating. But isn't it? It's that desire, right? It's the same thing as buying that luxury handbag. But I think for those families that are simply looking for a good education, you might not need to shell out all that money for certain types of name brand schools. Now, that's not to say, because I don't want everyone to think we hate the Ivies or the elite schools, because I went to one as well. But it can be life-changing, right, for certain populations to attend some of those institutions. And I think it's sometimes worthwhile for students that, for example, do not have their own network. So like those first generation students, for example, or students that come from low income backgrounds. But again, like you said before, most of the time they don't graduate with as much debt because they meet financial need. So it's really interesting because like the elite schools then are like comprised of some low income and, needs, but also most people that can pay full price. And it's that middle class, as you mentioned, that's being squeezed out. So I do think like in certain situations, and you can tell me, Mark, when you think it does make sense to quote unquote, go after that education. But that's what I would say is like being a first generation student myself.
I'm really glad you brought up Georgetown's newest findings on some of this and teasing out, what going to particular types of schools or name brand schools actually does in your future earnings or future success, and how you're going to determine and define success that's a 20-page paper on its own. So with Georgetown coming out and saying that it really doesn't matter, but they did put the footnote of depending on what you're going to either do or as a profession. And I think that's an important part because it would be disingenuous and ignorant to say that going to a school where a certain group of people who are going to be in the industry you are going to work in happen to be, that network is invaluable. For political science, finance, economics, all of those are things that being around people who are going to work in that area, either based on who their family is or what their direction in life appears to be, their trajectory. It would be ignorant to say that doesn't influence some of your future success. But as an engineer, I can tell you as engineering students have to, and pre-med students, you have to learn a certain amount of foundational information. And you can do that almost anywhere. So to say that you have to go to a particular school, that really isn't backed up by, setting you up for the MCAT or setting you up for other particular areas of education. But to be surrounded where you have opportunities to be driven by other students who are also motivated in the same area as you are, that's invaluable. So there again, you have to look at the risk reward, the return on investment of which schools you're going to and the people who are going to surround you as well. So those are all parts of that bigger question to ask of what's success and what's a good return on investment for you.
I love that you said that, Mark. So Mark, you being into engineering, is there a difference for engineering, do you think? So
it's funny because I'm going to sound like a hypocrite. And and it's interesting because I have had parents ask me that, and I'd say, they'll ask me, are there particular schools where you can become a better engineer? And honestly, having hired hundreds of engineers and scientists, I can tell you that, yeah, there tends to be schools where I know that if I'm going to interview somebody and I'm going to ask them the hard questions, they have a much better chance of answering them in a way that is preparing them for the job. And what I mean by that is, have they had an opportunity to think through some of the things that they're going to do in that profession? And yeah, for engineers, I sell Olin School of Engineering all day long. MIT is another great school. It has its own, pluses and minuses, but the engineers that I see from MIT they are good engineers. Same with Harvey Mudd, Rose Holman. But there are also, and the thing is, engineering schools don't often have the name brand associated that students will think with, well, it's an elite college. So most students, when I say Olin, they have no clue of where Olin is or what it is. And so then after I outline what that school provides, and then I tell them only 100 students are accepted each year and half their tuition's paid for, then I get their attention. So
that reminds me of Cooper Union too.
Yep.
In New York.
Yep.
Yeah, that's another one that I think pays half tuition. They used to pay full tuition. But yeah, I think they switched years ago. But no, I totally agree with you. I have a student at Rose Holman actually, and he's loving it. And it was a great fit for him. So let's talk about a little bit about where can people go, or what resources should they use when going through and picking colleges if they want to better educate themselves about looking beyond brands. And it could very well be that Best Fit could be a top university, quote unquote, like an elite school. But what are some of the books? I know like the Holy Grail is Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be by Frank Bruni. But what are some other ones that you like to share with your students? And do you actually like have them read it, or do you just like list it as a resource and say, hey, you might want to check this out?
Well, one thing I like to do is, I mean, as a scientist and psychologist, what I love are this question of, does it matter really where you go to college? Is that going to have a large influence on your success, however you define that, later in life or in your profession? And there again, your marketing, and we were talking about marketing and what social desire is driven by. And I think it's important to say that you can spin data until it says what you want. And Frank Bruni's book is fantastic. I like that he went into that and it tried to tease it apart, a very difficult question, basically using tax return information. And he came up with his isolation of an idea that it really didn't matter that much. Well, Paul Tough took very similar data and came up with a different perspective on whether it influenced success. And he isolated different particular groups of students who were more successful. And much like you said, if you are a first generation and you are being put into a very different environment for education, it can have a profound influence on your future trajectory. So Paul Tough took the same kind of information and came up with a different conclusion. His book is The Years That Matter Most: How Does College Make or Break Us? But it's also been released on another with another title called The Inequality Machine: How Colleges Divide Us, which is an interesting. I don't know why.
An interesting title.
Yeah, isn't it? So those, I actually have parents and students read those and say, you come to your own conclusion. But there again, I think the big part is, much like we said, identify what success means and how you define it and what's most important to you. And then you can start saying, is this the college that's preparing me for my definition of future success?
I love that you said it's like my definition of future success, because success varies from people to people. And I was reading a post today and someone was saying how their waiter was taking a gap year after graduating from an Ivy League university because they just didn't know what to do.
Yep.
And I think that's another thing that I would challenge students to think about is not only what might you want to major in, but what kind of education? How do you define education? And what kind of education do you want? Right. And I've seen more college prompts with this as well. Georgetown has it. I think I saw it as one of UPIT's honors college prompts this year is, what does it mean to be educated? And I think that hopefully will challenge students as well to think about, well, what does education mean to you? And what kind of school can provide the education you're looking for? Because I've mentioned it before, I think, but like my brother went to a liberal arts college, which was so crazy for my Asian parents at the time, especially after he'd gotten into an Ivy League school. But he chose to attend this liberal arts college, and this little liberal arts college. And it was interesting because, you know, he works in finance now. And the truth is, I think if he'd gone to the Ivy University, he would have probably been successful as well. I think it's just, you know, a part of it is character, right, as a student. But I think the interesting thing is that when he went and he did job interviews, and later on when people like people explained why they hired him or they offered him a job offer, they explained that the way he analyzed and the way he approached like the job was different from the people coming out of top business schools. And that would have only come from the liberal arts education he got. And so he is definitely unique in his space. And so I think, therefore, I would say, like, sometimes you have to think about, how do I want to learn? You know, do I want to be told what to learn? Or do I want to have a place that lets me breathe room and figure things out potentially too? Or like we talk about with engineering as well, hands-on versus not, or, you know, but I think that's something that's really important for students to consider as well.
I love that your brother went to a tiny little liberal arts college, and he works in finance. And when I explain to students and parents that, you know, one of the big things that drives liberal arts education is they teach you to think, write, and communicate effectively. That's one of their main, you know, tenets that you graduate being able to do. And I can see where learning those skills in the world of finance might be very handy. It
is. He uses those three skills all the time.
It's funny when we're talking about books. There's another one that I have students especially read. One of them is by William Dershowitz, and he talks. His book's called "Excellent Sheep: Misdirection of American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life." And I heard he's a professor at Yale, and I've heard David Brooks of fame and fortune, who also taught at Yale, and I've heard him say very similar things, that, you know, when you get a certain type of student who's been successful in the education program, in that they've learned how to do testing and they've learned how to do education, meaning they know how to get into those schools. But both of them, you know, comment, they, you know, as a professor, they see papers that come in that show this student doesn't know how to think for themselves. They only know how to do school. They give me the answer that, you know, they think is expected, but they can't think on their own. And I there again, you said, what kind of environment do you want to be in when you are at a school? And it should drive a big part of the schools you apply to, for sure.
I think that segues nicely into the last book, which we would recommend, is Colleges That Change Lives. And we've had a chance to speak with someone from there, that organization before. But yes, what kind of interesting transformative experiences do you hope to have, whether that be in or out of the classroom? And what kind of community do you want to join? Because I also often tell my students, and a good amount of my students go to a certain Ivy, and they struggle a bit academically and socially sometimes in that transition. But, you know, what kind of experience are you looking for? Because it might not just be academic or professional. Maybe there's something socially or personally that you are also hoping to tap into as well.
You know, those students that you have come to you and families, and the student basically outlines what's most important to them when they go to college, and they talk about, you know, trying to find out who they are, learning adult skills, learning to become a good communicator, networker, and, you know, learn to write well, learn what they do well, and then, you know, study academics at a very high level. And it's funny, I'll bring up the colleges that change lives. And I don't think I've ever had a student who's gone to one of the 44 of those colleges who has not said they've had an outstanding educational experience and that prepared them for the rest of either academia or for their professional career. And I think that's one of those interesting conversations and trying to see which students are already there. They understand this is an invaluable investment. So it's an interesting thing who I talk to about, the 44 colleges that change lives and who I think will be receptive. I don't know if you've run into that.
I definitely have. I think it's a little harder sometimes because I think part of it is like you don't hear about them as often. But again, marketing, right? Are we just hearing buzz? Or like you said, like they send out those handy dandy marketing flyers, like you should apply here. And it happens all the time. Well, I got this postcard from so-and-so and they said I should apply. And like I've had that also come from like non-Ivy Leagues and non-top tier schools, but some other institutions as well. And I always ask these questions like, oh, well, how much research have you done into this? And, so on and so forth. So I think it's like partially that marketing still is prevalent, but I think the more we can educate families and make them more informed consumers or investors, as you put it, the better or the outcome will be for their experience. And that's why I think, like you said, like colleges that change lives, those students have transformative experiences because they're open to having that open mind in terms of where can I go to college, right? And I think the other thing we didn't tackle yet, which is affordability. A little bit and like the debt, college debt right now, Mark. I mean, how have those conversations been going for you and your families, and how does it play a role in these elite schools?
Well, one of the things that's really nice in teeing up that conversation with families right now is because there is so much talk about student loan debt and student loan debt relief. And why is that needed? And I think it's an opportunity for teens to actually see adults who are dealing with the debt that they took on, either because they weren't educated or because they wanted the Gucci bag. And I think now they see the reality that if you take on large amounts of student debt and you're carrying that into your adult life, and just for the record, I think it's 14% of parents are still paying off their student debt as they are sending off their student into college. So with that in mind, I tell students, student debt is a lifestyle choice. If you take on a huge amount of debt, you're going to have to pay it back. And you're going to have to make some lifestyle choices, whether you want to or not, while you're paying that debt back. So making that a smaller debt is to your advantage so that you don't have these years and years of student loan payments. But right now, I think average student debt is just under $40,000. It's like $38,000.
Wow.
And that's everybody. I mean, that's a huge chunk of change. And then 20 years after entering school, half of the student borrowers are still $20,000 in debt. So 20 years after, still $20,000 in debt.
That's insane. But I think, and that's an important conversation, especially to have with people that are considering graduate school, right? Like medical school, law school. And I love that actually it's some of the Ivies, they list like this matriculation information, like where did their entering class, like what colleges did they graduate from? And I point to that all the time when we're talking about ranks and brands and all that stuff. And I'm like, look, they come from non-Ivy institutions and non-top tier institutions too. And they all end up at the same place. So you don't have to, especially if it's going to cost you a lot of money or your family a lot of debt to do it, right? Like it's you don't have to do that. And I love that you said it's a lifestyle change, because like I don't think people think about it, but like that's a car, right? That's maybe your wedding one day. That's a deposit on a house potentially, right? Lifestyle changes, you know, in terms of like, what are you willing to give up?
Well, I actually use in public presentations, I use a slide that has a Lamborghini, I think it's a Sian, which is, $2 million. And then I show a picture of a Fit, which is, $20,000. And I say, you can choose either one of these to get to the store or where you want to go, but you're going to look a little different to society in one of them. But at the end of the journey, when you get to the store, one, you're still going to be paying off for decades. The other one, you could probably pay off while you're in college. Mm-hmm. And then you can consider graduate school, which is a direct influence on the trajectory of your professional career. And that's one thing. Name brand of your graduate school, that's a pretty clear, evidence-based, statistically supported. It has an influence on your success, if success is financial value, if that's one of your determining factors of success. Your graduate school name brand does influence that.
Yes, save it and spend it on grad school, right?
Agreed.
This was so helpful, Mark. Any closing thoughts as people consider fit and brand and rank in this upcoming admission season?
Yeah, I think the thing is, I think all students and families should spend a couple of moments to reflect on the really base and foundational questions before they start examining schools. And that's, why do you want to go to college, and how do you define success once you leave? And then also, what are the main things that you're going to college for, and make sure that that's what that college provides, so that, you're not going into debt buying Beanie Babies that you're going to have sitting around the house and you really didn't want in the first place.
I love that you said that. This one's going to call out to the teens in terms of my parting wisdom. So YOLO, you only live once, I think is something that teens often approach college with. Well, if I only live once, I might as well go to the best school possible, right? But yep. YOLO, you only live once. So why not pick the school that makes you happiest and is the best suited for you? In the sense that, like, if going back to where I started at the beginning, my student then realized, and she did transfer to a college that she absolutely loves. And she's like, it was just so silly that I chose to be miserable at another school just because I didn't do the research, because all I cared about was the rank and the name. But if I had actually just spent more time like reflecting and thinking about what was really important, I didn't have to be miserable for that year or that year and a half. And so, and then if you have to take debt out, you might be potentially miserable for decades. So what I would say, a long time. So what I would say is, if you're going to apply YOLO, then I hope you apply it in a different way, and that you think a bit more long-term in terms of prioritizing your happiness.
Agreed. Thank you, Anna. That was a great conversation. Hopefully we have some students and families who take a step back and ask themselves some really foundational questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for listening to College Admissions with Mark and Anna, where we make getting into college easy and fun. Don't forget to go over to iTunes and subscribe to get updated each time we release a new episode. Also, for more helpful college admissions information, visit our website at www.collegeadmissionspodcast.com.